Hello, and welcome to Speaking of Our Words, radio programming that brings you a wide range of voices and stories of local writers and offers you some insight into their creative process. My name is Jim Janus. I'm a member of the Kenosha Writers Guild, and today I will be your host, filling in for Chris DeGuire. Today we have a number of open mic readers, but first we'll start with special guest author Michael Perry. Here to interview Mike is Kenosha Writers Guild member Dave Gourdoux. Dave, take it away.
Thanks, Jim. It's my privilege and honor to introduce a true Wisconsin treasure. Author of the acclaimed memoirs Population 485, Coop, Truck, A Love Story, and Visiting Tom. Michael Perry is also a humorist, NPR variety show host, and singer-songwriter and frontman for the band Longbeds. He's currently on a book tour promoting his new book, the mid-grade novel The Scavengers, and he was kind enough to take time out of his busy schedule to talk with us today. So welcome, Michael Perry.
Well, thanks for having me, Dave.
And this is where if we had a studio audience, they'd be applauding wildly right now. But
Oh, okay. Well, don't make too many assumptions, but we'll go with that.
So how are you?
I'm doing all right. I'm out on the road here for about a month, talking about the new book and just kind of putting some miles on and writing in hotel rooms in between.
Well, that's a perfect segue into my first question. I was going to ask you, our show here is produced by a talented but relatively unknown group of writers, all of us who dream of one day being the center of our own book tours. So I wonder if you could engage our deepest writer fantasies and regale us with some stories of decadence and depravity from life on the road as a best-selling author.
Well, I'm afraid people will be pretty disappointed. In the first place, I'm in this weird area. I'm so grateful for the way things have gone. And I am currently, for instance, on this book tour. My publisher is supporting me by paying for my gas and paying for the hotel rooms. But honestly, it's get up and drive to a new place every day. And for this tween book that I'm out for, I'm doing 3 to 4 school presentations every day, and then in the evening, reading and signing at a bookstore. So you get a little short on sleep, you get long on caffeine, and here's the most glamorous thing that I've done today. Just before I took this phone call, came from one floor down in the hotel where I was doing my laundry in a coin-operated washing machine. So, and later, just because today I actually have a block of free time, I'm going to celebrate by cleaning out the van.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So that's, try to keep up. That's the red-hot life of a moderately, I guess, successful mid-list writer, I guess, yeah.
So no groupies, red M&Ms, or miniature Stonehenges, huh?
No, if there's any red M&Ms, it's only because they're in there with all the other ones. But other than that, no. I had a wonderful little moment. This book tour, I won't be seeing my family for a month. I got to see them for just a couple hours at the end of the first week of tour, but then I've been back out. But last weekend, my wife and I were able to meet on a Sunday when I didn't have any events, and she drove 3 hours across the state one way, and I drove 3 hours the other way, and we had a nice day together.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Well, so let's talk about your new book, The Scavengers. Those who are familiar with your memoir work are going to be pretty surprised by this, I think. It's quite a departure for you.
Yeah, it's a departure, although it's funny. I've had a couple of people say that they've enjoyed the book, but that it took them 2 or 3 chapters to stop hearing me. Because obviously bits of ourselves creep in no matter what, and I never come right out and I never state the protagonist's exact age, but she's basically a 12-year-old girl, and as I progressed with the book, she took over more and more, but of course there's some of my inflections in there as a writer, and so folks have said that they can hear me in there a little bit. But yeah, it's a departure, but it's also been There are a couple reasons I wanted to do it. One was that the publisher asked me if I would, and they asked about 4 or 5 years ago, and I declined for a couple of years for a few reasons. One, out of respect to genre. I always think you have to be careful. You can't necessarily jump from one genre to another. And I had been working just in nonfiction memoir. And then the other reason was I didn't really have a fully formed idea for a novel. But then about 2 or 3 years passed, and I germinated an idea and kind of started shaping it up. And then the other very frank part was, here I had this publisher interested, and then I was looking at our health insurance premiums, and I was thinking I kind of need to line up some work. And so I took 3 days and holed up and just did nothing but work on the character and on the premise, and wrote some scenes that described the environment, and wrote out a plot arc, and then I sent that in, and we approached the publisher again, and they consented to have me do it. So then came the tricky part, which was actually, we all love coming up with ideas, but actually executing them on the page is another thing. But I very much enjoyed the fiction because I loved creating the characters, and I loved creating the unusual environment. Where I struggled was with plot. That's because I've struggled with plot in my own personal life. So,
well, it's interesting because I detected just what you said, the same setting as in your, as what we're familiar with northwestern Wisconsin has just been melted a little bit by global warming.
Yeah, I definitely, I never say specifically where Maggie, who's the protagonist of this book, where she is, but it's pretty clearly drawn from a landscape that I'm familiar with, and that happens to be we live on a ridge, she lives on a ridge. We have neighbors who help us out who live down in the valley, and so a lot of it, one of the ways that Maggie and her family survive is by scavenging, thus the title, The Scavengers. And they have an old ravine behind the house that's filled with discarded goods and junk from all the years. And we have that same ravine at our farm. For decades, the farmers just went out back and threw their junk in a ravine. And we have one of those. And I've been saying in my interviews that on the one hand, it's an environmental tragedy. On the other hand, my kids love it. It's this endless treasure hunt down there. And so, yeah, all those things are obviously drawn from my regular life, but then you get to run wild with expanding on that. I guess what I would say is that my home base of Wisconsin serves as the home base for the book, but then you get to just travel in whatever direction you want from there.
Yeah, I recognize Noburn in there.
Yeah, that was fun because I like to throw out little salutes to my hometown whenever I can, because I come from the little town of New Albern, Wisconsin, and I just feel so grateful that was my background and that was my experience, and I still have roots there and family and friends, and so whenever possible I like to throw a little tip of the cap to my hometown. So there is a town where Maggie and her friend Toad, her octogenarian pal Toad, and they go into trade and barter with the things they've scavenged, and so when it came time to name that town, I named it Noburn.
It's funny you mentioned the junkyard in your ravine, because I've got some hunting property up by Bruce, and I came across a stash of junk, and it's just about time I was telling somebody they got everything in there but the kitchen sink. What'd I find? The kitchen sink.
I've often said that, at least where I'm from, one of the best deer blinds you could ask for would be an old hot water heater, because they're everywhere. And the deer are so used to seeing them that if you sat inside there, they wouldn't think twice about it.
Yeah.
But then on the other hand, it's not a good deer blind because every single one I've ever seen is riddled with bullet holes, so it's not really the kind of place you want to hide, I guess.
And I'm going to call you on something that northern Wisconsiners are guilty of down here. They remind me, if it's not a hot water heater, it's a water heater. It's whatever already hot, we need to heat it.
That sounds like you must be the kind of guy who writes me little notes when we find typos.
So, one of my favorite anecdotes that you share in Population 485 is how they wanted to put you on a float labeled writer in the Jamboree Days Parade. And when I interviewed you last year, I think I asked you about the persona that you as a performer and an author is cultivated. That in your memoirs, Michael Perry is always a character in the stories you tell. What do you feel like writing a story that you weren't a character in? Did you feel vulnerable or were you liberated?
Liberated mostly. I mean, it was fun to just, as I said, taking the characters in whatever direction I felt they wanted to go. That was fun. I love the creativity in that. I love the freedom in that. The only issue is that sometimes you wonder if you're, especially in this case where protagonist is a young girl. Obviously, I have 2 daughters, and I've observed them, and I hope that I'm doing an okay job of conveying that character. But you do feel a certain liability as a guy writing about that stuff, and so you do hope sometimes that you're getting it right and not projecting too much yourself. But other than that, I really enjoyed it. It's fun to let characters. One thing that I have said in a couple of interviews about this book is that I used to always make fun of my fiction writing friends, and I know some of you are listening right now, and I'd always get on their case because they would tell me, the character just takes over and speaks through me. It's not even me speaking. And I'd always, I'm Mr. Clodhopper, boots on the ground. I'd roll my eyes. And, well, what happened is when I started working really hard on this book, I got about 3 chapters in, and I just realized if it was to have any sort of veracity, I had to just shut up and let Maggie, the main character, do the talking. And things really started to get interesting after I'd turned things over to her. And so as a result of that, I now have to write letters of apology to all my fiction writing friends.
One thing I found in kind of my neophyte efforts of being a writer is I tried writing some memoirs and some fiction too, but for me, when I wrote fiction, it always feels somehow more personal and more vulnerable than memoirs. And I think it's because it's your own imagination, that somehow feels a little more raw to me.
Well, I can't say that it's been the same for me, although there's a different sort of vulnerability, which is it's you saying, hey, here's a story that I wrote that I made up myself, and I think I hope you'll find it interesting, and then you're making yourself very vulnerable that way. But for me, the nonfiction, that leaves me feeling more personally vulnerable, because a lot of times, I'm a very private person day to day. I'm stoic, Scandinavian, that whole sort of thing, and I don't share, and I don't overshare. And then someone will come up to me, and they'll ask me about some little part of me that's very private, and I'll say, well, how did you know that? And they'll say, well, you wrote about it on page 76 of whichever book. And I'll just say, well, I shouldn't have done that. And, of course, what it is, it's when you're a writer and you're trying to get the work done and it's late and you're vulnerable and you're wondering how you're going to pay the rent, you do get vulnerable, and then you start opening up and you write things that you wouldn't normally share in conversation. And so I think for me, I get more personally vulnerable writing the nonfiction. But I do understand what you're saying.
But no, it used to make sense too, and I think that some of your best stuff probably comes from some of those more vulnerable moments when you open yourself up.
Well, as a guy, I've screwed up in my life off and on, and it's one of the things that comes from messing up is that vulnerability and that fallibility and being forced to recognize it in yourself. And then what I find the upside of that is, I think it's from there that we get compassion. Because, I'd like to think I've always been a compassionate person, but I'll tell you, my compassion took a tick upwards after those times in my life when I screwed up.
Yeah, and I think that's something as readers we respond to as well, is we recognize that maybe you screwed up there, and we recognize our own failings and times we've screwed up. And
yeah, I think the world could use more compassion, that's for sure.
Yeah. So, would you be willing to share maybe a 5-minute or so reading from The Scavengers?
Yeah, maybe the best option would be the most obvious, which is I'll read the introduction where we meet Maggie, the protagonist.
Okay, great.
The old car was sunk to the bumpers when I discovered it. But my first thought was how good it would be to sleep in there and hear the rain drumming on steel rather than splattering against our tattered old tarp. I was Maggie back then. Maggie, the name my parents gave me. A nice name, but these weren't nice times. We were tired and hungry, and the gray devil bonfires were burning brighter, and the solar bear howls were getting closer, and every morning as I strapped my spit stick across my back and set out to scavenge, I found myself thinking I needed a better name, a stronger name. I mean, the name Maggie was fine. It just seemed kind of underpowered. So when I scrubbed the moss from the side of that old car overlooking Goldmine Gully and saw the chrome letters, Ford, Falcon, I climbed up on the hood and stood there with my steel-toed boots planted wide, and I wedged my fists on my hips, and I announced that Maggie was yesterday, and from this day forward I would answer only to Ford Falcon. Ford because we had a lot of rivers to cross. Falcon because, well, if you have a lot of rivers to cross, a pair of wings can't hurt. And then once you get across the river, it's likely you will need sharp eyes and an even sharper beak. Yes, I know. I named myself after an old, dead car. Worse yet, it's not even a cool car. It's a station wagon. Station wagons were how parents hauled kids around during the time between covered wagons and minivans. These days you won't see a minivan unless it's being pulled by a horse, and even horses are hard to come by. But if you see me, you will know me, because I wear a vest made from the hide of a beast that tried to kill me and lost. I skinned that beast myself, and also I skinned the lettering from that old dead car and stitched it to the vest across my shoulder blades using copper wire so that in polished chrome the world can read my name and know it. Ford Falcon.
Wow, that's great. And it reminds me of not only how well you write, but I've had the fortune to be able to attend a couple of your book signings and listen to you read in person. Anybody out there who's looking for a great evening, go out to Sneezing Cow and find your scheduled events because you're a fantastic reader as well as writer.
I appreciate that. That was just something I learned early on, that if you're going to survive, unless you're selling 1 million books, and I'm not, if you're going to survive as a writer, you have to know how to present your stuff off the page. And so I've worked hard to try and make readings entertaining and, heartfelt but humorous, that whole thing. And I appreciate you saying that because, I've worked pretty hard at that.
I saw you in Chicago last year at a cool little bookstore, and there were about 15 of us were there. And you gave a monologue that Jerry Seinfeld would have envied. I think your timing was impeccable. It was hilarious. It was a great night out. It was fantastic.
Yeah, sometimes people say that they'll see one of my funny readings. They'll say, "You should be a comedian," but I'll tell them no. Being a comedian is the hardest gig in the world. I think it's harder than singing opera or anything, just because of the expectations the audience has. Whereas if someone shows up to see an author and he turns out to be funny or she turns out to be witty, then you're pleasantly surprised. Whereas with a comedian, they've kind of put a chip on your shoulder from the get-go by charging you $25 and a 3-drink minimum.
Very true. One of the things I wanted to ask you about in the Scavengers is one of the interesting choices you make is to tell the story in present tense. So you'd already mentioned the kind of challenge of having a young girl as your narrator protagonist, but what about writing in the present tense? That kind of intrigues me.
I don't know how to answer that because I just sort of work organically, and I started. It seemed easier for me to speak through the character when I was doing it as if everything was happening in the present. Now I'm working. My next book is a novel, a piece of fiction as well, a novel, but it's for an adult audience, and that one I'm writing in the past tense. So I'm not sure why. I wish I had a better answer for you, Dave. I had some good, long, involved answer, but as far as this book, it just seemed to be easier to operate in Maggie's mind if I was just dealing with things as they arose.
Well, that's interesting. I wonder if it's because as an adult you've got so much past to draw on. As a child, you don't.
Well, and in a way, I mean, we could get a little bit philosophical here and say that children do tend to deal with things more immediately and in the presence, whereas adults, we are reflecting and comparing what's confronting us now with what has confronted us in the past and those sort of things. But we'd maybe have to stay up till about 4 in the morning to get that discussion right.
I find it interesting from a narrative standpoint. I think the present tense is obviously more active and a little more urgent. So, but for me, it was always difficult to kind of remain consistently in that tense.
Yeah, it's good to have I mean, I occasionally would slip here and there, and that's my editor was very good at catching that, and reminding me.
Okay, one other thing I wanted to talk to you about was we touched on it earlier, but your writing often deals with the intersection of time and place, and in your memoir writing, the past is always a very strong presence, and I kind of got that in the Scavengers as well. That these are people who are living literally off the grid, and they have to rely upon their wits. And you find this old Boy Scout manual from the 1880s, and I find it very interesting that here in this kind of futuristic dystopian environment you create, you have people who are going back to the way things were done in the past, and that seems to be a consistent theme with some of your memoir stuff.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that was I've listened to a lot of books written for this audience because I have 2 daughters who are just avid consumers of books and audiobooks, and there's a lot of these books are somewhat metaphysical, or the protagonists are using new technology, that sort of thing. And I just thought it would be interesting to put Maggie in a situation where, not by choice, but by default, she has to survive on her wits, and by using things that she can make simply from simple materials. And that was kind of the net that I put up for that particular tennis game, if you will. And I also had this it's called the American Boy's Handy Book, and it was written in the late 1800s, early 1900s by a friend of Mark Twain's, and I had a copy in my office, and I'd read it now and then, and I'd get, you get that feeling that you did when you were a kid, oh, wow, I could make my own raft. And so I just thought it'd be interesting if Maggie had that book and had to, she makes an oven from the mud and stones based on the instructions from this old book, and she makes, some of her weapons are based on instructions in that book. But then it's also fun because, of course, this book being written for boys in that particular time and place is just so dismissive of girls, and there's even a line in there that makes Maggie angry. And so it was just kind of fun to use that past. But here, the skills were very fundamental and functional and useful, but the some of the attitude in the book really raised her back.
Yeah, and I want to be careful that all my questions about themes and big, important, writerly things don't detract from the fact that it's a very funny book.
Oh, yeah, I appreciate that. There's a couple of reasons for the humor. One is that I wanted I wanted Maggie to be somewhat complex in the sense that it was my desire she be strong and independent, and she is. It'd be my desire that she show some vulnerability because, again, as the father of daughters, I see this. But the one thing I also wanted was for her to be funny and for her to confront some of actually her most dire situations with other humans. She deals with them with humor because she finds it to be such an effective weapon for cutting people bigger than her down to her size. And so, I threw some humor in there. And also, part of the reason for the humor is one always wants to put something in these books for grown-up readers, because, again, as a father, you end up reading these books, and I also wanted it to be interesting enough that it would hold the interest of an adult. Even though I was writing for a younger audience, I kept trying to think, keep in mind, someone somewhere told me it's okay to write for someone, but it's not okay to write at someone. And so I didn't want to consciously be writing at a younger audience, but rather just writing a story for readers.
Oh, excellent. Well, you just made me forget what I was going to ask you for now.
I'm pretty good at forgetting what.
It was a really good question, too. Damn. Well, anyhow. It's really bothering me. My mind is going. Anyhow, so what advice would you give to members of the guild here who are maybe still struggling to get published or starting out here? Pursuing our romantic writerly dreams?
Well, it's tough. I mean, I think that's the bottom line. There's no getting around the fact that it's tough, and there's so many factors involved. Hard work is involved, and I like to think that I've done a lot of hard work, and I continue to do hard work. It's less smooth than it might appear. You look at the book covers, everything looks all together, but behind the scenes, believe me, it's patchwork and it's a hustle. But there's also luck involved. I mean, I was just so fortunate that I spent about 8-10 years writing on my own, self-published 4 books, just hammered around everywhere with my little card table and setting it up at gift shops and craft fairs and selling maybe 1 book a week. But I just kept at it. And then someone saw one of my pieces, and that led to something else. And as all things in life do, one thing led to another. So I think one of the main things is you can't try to get everything perfect. Man, I just would get my stuff out there, and there's things I look back at. There's some of my self-published books that make me cringe, but you know what? They were a necessary step in the process. Even the ones that weren't the best writing, I still learned about the editing process. I learned about book promotion, and the writing, that just came with working on it every day. So I'm babbling because that's kind of what I do for a living, but it's all these things. At the core of it, at the heart of it, is the writing, the time you take when you sit down every day and you work on the craft. But then on the other end of it, it's just get your stuff out there. Don't hide it forever, and don't take one piece of writing and try to polish it for the rest of your life. Just keep working on new stuff and moving on, because that's when you really make important discoveries and progress.
Yeah, I saw you at the Writers Institute conference last spring, and you gave the keynote address, and you spoke very eloquently about the love of writing and what a privilege it is to be able to go and write every day.
Yeah, this is the thing. I just can't believe it. Here I am, even today, and it sounds so cornball when I say it, but I'm making it up. When I went down to get my laundry out of the coin-operated dryer, even that moment, there's this consciousness that, holy goodness, just because I sat down and typed for 10 years, now I get to do this, and I feel very, very grateful.
Well, we're all very grateful as well, Mike, and thank you very much for taking the time to be on our little show here. It's going to mean a great deal to us and our group, and we thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. We'll see you guys down the road.
Okay, thanks.
Yep, thanks, Dave Gourdoux, and thanks again, Michael Perry. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And now to our open mic portion of the show. Next up is writer Dave Gourdoux. Dave, what do you have for us?
I have a short piece that I posted to my website last spring.
Okay, Dave, take it away.
It's called Unending. She is sitting next to me. The windows are rolled down, and the wind is flowing through her hair. My arm is around her. Her left hand is resting on the inside of my right thigh. It's a late afternoon of a brilliant summer day. I'm driving on a remote patch of state highway. Everything is green and warm. A moment later, we're waking up with sunlight streaming through the window shades. We're lying on our right sides, and my left arm is wrapped around her waist. My head is buried in her brown hair that's spread across her pillow. Then we're driving down another county highway. It's snowing, big flakes, starting to come down hard. The March landscape, a dreary mosaic of grays and browns. She's looking out her window, her eyes big and sad. I'm driving, we're headed for home, The only sounds, the blowing of the defroster, the humming of the tires on the pavement, and the echo of the neurologist's words in our heads. She'll be there again tonight, I think to myself. Everything else can change. The rest of the world can crumble and fall apart. But come the night, come the dark, she'll be there, like she is every night. And together we'll navigate the landscape of dreams, and for a few hours wrap ourselves in each other, beyond the reach of the cold and unfeeling grip of disease.
Dave Gourdoux, thank you very much. And next up is Irene Bilak. Irene, what do you have for us today?
I have a part of my novel. It's called Quest to Find Nadia by the Stocks. I've run into a snag again, Xenia, Ted reported to his wife early one day. I tried to contact the people you told me about. The gentleman was wary of my request. He said he could look for our daughter in Budapest when he went to visit his relatives, but he didn't know if they would talk. The Soviets have the Hungarians by the throat. People are afraid of their own shadow. Everyone is afraid. Too many people have wound up in prison without a trial and without really being guilty of anything except that they were patriotic Hungarian citizens. Your friend said that he would try because he knows how much finding Nadia means to us. I gave him a large sum of money for his cooperation. Tears crept up again like dewdrops in Xenia's eyes. What was the use? They tried so many times to find Nadia through many channels, attorneys, consuls, civic organizations. Xenia's friend Oksana had traveled with an interest group through Budapest and Kiev. Xenia had given her friend photographs and as good of a description as possible of Nadia as a little girl, but to no avail. Several months had passed. The Stocks wanted to go to Hungary to find their daughter themselves. They had not received their visas, however. Facilitating a visa in the 70s from countries behind the Iron Curtain was very difficult. They were tired of waiting and beseeched those who had a visa for Hungary to help them. Xenia, the interest agent, kept me in his office for an hour interrogating me. He asked me why I was inquiring about Nadia, who was she to me, and why did I come to Hungary pretending to be a tourist. I explained to him that I was doing my friend a favor since I was in the city, and yes, I was a tourist. Did he wonder why I did not come myself to look for my daughter? Inquired Xenia. He said he knew. He knew your whole family was a nationalist trouble-making bunch, having others doing your dirty work while you were making American dollars to bolster up Ukrainian causes and trying to ruin the Soviet Union's reputation, replied Oksana. It was laughable, but the fact that he knew so much about all of us and our lives in the United States sent shivers down my spine. He knew that we had children in Ukrainian Scouts, to which parish church we belonged, and even that you had gone to the Ukrainian National Women's Convention in New York. He also knew that I had gone to my cousin's wedding in New Jersey. Imagine that. There must be Soviet spies in all major Ukrainian communities here in the United States and in Canada, reported Oksana breathlessly. All the while that he was speaking, he kept smoking and snickering, showing me that whether he knew anything about Nadia or not, he wasn't going to share it with me. He even offered me a cigarette. Finally, after he wrung me out completely, he let me go, and the next day allowed me to continue my trip. Be careful, he said, opening the door. Remember, you are a guest in my country, which you left long ago. As much as I pretended to be brave, I was frightened, added Oksana. Xenia sighed, remembering that conversation. After months of waiting, The visas finally arrived. Ted and Xenia embarked on their own journey to find Nadia. In Budapest, there appeared to be a brick wall wherever they inquired. They were sneered at as rich, spoiled Americans, show-offs, and capitalists, even though Xenia and Ted were as humble and as quiet about their business as they could. The police were of no help. The mayor's office kept no records of children left behind in wartime, or so they said. There was no trace of Claudia Rosan or her husband, the couple who had requested to keep their daughter safe during the war. Unbeknownst to the Stacks, the Rosans had been deported to Siberia. They were later forgiven and returned to Budapest. At the time of the Stacks' visit, they were still absent. Budapest was a large, bustling metropolis. 2 weeks of inquiry only resulted in frustration and dead ends. "Don't look behind you, Xenia, but we're being followed. It's the same gentleman that was sitting across from us in the restaurant," warned Teddy, as they got on the bus en route to the airport, which would take them back to the United States without their daughter. "Yes, I saw him too. I tried not to stare and not to notice. We've been followed all along for these 2 weeks. I'm really tired. I hope we get home safely. This has been a harrowing experience, a fruitless search. But I'm glad we did it. The search was important. It had to be done." Boarding the bus, the Stacks quietly sat in their seats. They could not admire the scenery, the architecture, the setting sun, nor the people bustling about the street. They were exhausted, depleted of energy and hope. Their daughter Nadia seemed lost to them. Looking for her was unbelievably difficult. The burden was also heavy because they both noticed the difference of dealing with people in a democracy, in an open society, versus a Soviet, secret, forbidden, and closed society, hostile to any open questions or comments. How had Nadia survived in all this, they wondered, or had she? And where was she? "I will be very glad to get home to Michigan, to my house, to my sons, and to my friends," whispered Xenia to Ted, as she noticed that the man in the gray suit was also on the bus. He evidently was going to follow them to the airport. "Yes, you're right," whispered Teddy. "I can't wait to lose this guy and not have to whisper. He must think we're up to no good. Our Western clothes betray us, and the fact that we were not with a tour group makes all of them more suspicious of our trip." The lines were long, and the valises and personal belongings were scrutinized very carefully by the airport personnel. But since their passports were in order, the Stacks managed to get on their plane without incident. The fellow in the gray suit was nowhere to be seen.
Irene Bilak, thank you very much. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And next up, I'm going to read a poem that I wrote recently. This is called Living Honestly. I drive away from the corporate tower, brake, gas, brake, then all gas, staying back from the speeders in front, moving aside from the ones catching up. Another hour of life at 70 mph. Radio says we're sending troops thousands of miles away to kill bad guys, and nothing about the good ones to be killed living honestly. I swear, for the last few miles, even with the windows up, I can smell the trees and the tall grass, like I live in the country. At the kitchen table, my wife touches my hand, and we say a short prayer. The muted TV shows a hole in a school, with a caption about moderate rebels. The sun sets, yet the evening stays warm enough for a t-shirt and shorts. I sit on the deck looking west, imagining time has stopped. But the earth rolls me back, under a deepening dusk, under the same first pinpoints of light that awed children there 9 hours before. In my yard, the nighthawk that swoops is just a bird, chasing insects I can't see, and the crickets, with their trill, try hard to make up for the white nights gone away. And that was a poem that I wrote recently. And next up, I'm going to read a short piece by regular contributor Richard Bell. This is a short story called Teenage Mutant Blueberry Pancakes. It began like any other day, with Mrs. Crocker in the kitchen whipping up breakfast for her kids. This morning it was blueberry pancakes made with her special ingredient, sawdust. It made them a lot cheaper and gave the kids the fiber they needed. However, as she was taking the 3 pancakes off the stove, they suddenly began to scream, which gave the entire family heart attacks. Then the pancakes smashed out the back door and went in search of money. The Teenage Mutant Blueberry Pancakes started growing at incredible speed as they robbed people and ate their money. Once they knocked over the bank and ate all the money in the vault. They grew to be 100 feet tall each. There seemed to be no stopping them. They rolled up and down Main Street, terrorizing people and throwing giant blueberries at the police. Then they rolled onto Broadway and continued to rob people and stores and keep growing. The mayor called the governor, who called out the National Guard, and soon all the troops with tanks and helicopters were attacking the pancakes, but nothing seemed to stop their reign of terror. Then the governor called up the army, and more troops and tanks and jets were sent in. The mutant blueberry pancakes just laughed and fired giant blueberries at them all. Only now the blueberries burst into flame when they hit, and soon the town was on fire. Next, the Air Force and the Marines went in. Over 8,000 missiles were fired at the mutant pancakes, and they had no effect. 100,000 troops were sent in, and the pancakes laughed derisively. The Teenage Mutant Blueberry Pancakes screamed real loud, and all the troops had heart attacks. The situation seemed hopeless. The president's advisor finally had a real idea and ordered several trucks full of money to act as bait to lure the pancakes away from town. The trucks drove past the pancakes, and when they smelled the money, chased them to the ocean. That's when the Navy opened fire, sending hundreds of shells exploding all around the blueberry pancakes, but it had no effect at all. When all seemed hopeless, the president's advisor sent for Valentine Jablonski, who was a local hero and had once won a hot dog eating contest. Valentine grabbed his fork and a few napkins and rushed to the scene. Running faster than anyone could imagine, he started eating those mutant blueberry pancakes. All day and night he ate as they were chasing him and screaming. He even ate the giant blueberries. It was incredible. When Valentine had eaten all he could, he started throwing buckets of water onto the remaining pancake, which caused it to decompose and fall apart. When it was all over, Valentine Jablonski went back home and continued watching television. The end. And that was a short story by regular contributor Richard Bell. You are listening to Speaking of Our Words. And next up is Walter Gascoigne. Walter, what do you have for us?
A little short story I just wrote today.
Excellent. Take it away.
It's entitled How He Lived. When Roger woke up from being dead again, he immediately remembered where he was, but more importantly, he remembered all the moments that he had lived before he died. His earliest memory was when he was 5, and a friend of his suggested that it would be fun to smash little rocks with a big rock. Naturally, being a child, he thought this was a splendid idea. How better to prove one's strength than by dominating the weaker object? They carefully set in a row the small pebbles that they would shatter into dust, and proceeded to procure a rather large stone that would be used for the demolition. The first 4 rocks were no match for the larger one. All that remained were fine particles of dust. But when it came to the 5th stone, his friend only hit it with a glancing blow, so that the pebble tumbled out of line with the rest. Not wanting one of the rocks to escape destruction, Roger reached for it to put it back in its proper place, but as he did so, his friend brought the large stone down upon Roger's finger, making a bloody mess of the sidewalk. He remembered walking home, dazed, bloody, and unable to see clearly through his tears. When his mother saw him standing at the door, blood pouring from his hand, she let out a shriek. Minutes later, his grandmother pulled into the driveway to give them a ride to the emergency room. But before she would let them into the back seat, she had to make sure it was covered with a blanket to catch the never-ending flow of blood that fell from his finger. The next memorable experience occurred 2 years later, when Roger was just about to turn 8. It was early December, and the snow was just starting to fall, when he and his parents went for a car ride. The ride started off as pleasant enough until the car began to sputter and lose power, which made his father very angry. His father punched the dashboard and swore at the vehicle. As his mother tried to calm him down, his father turned to her and punched her in the face. He pulled the car to the side of the road and began beating her so badly that the front of the car was covered in blood and tufts of his mother's hair hung from the back of her seat. He remembered thinking to himself how much his mother was like those small pebbles, and how much his father was like that large stone that had crushed his finger. And when he grew up, he knew he wanted to be the stone and not one of the pebbles. After the divorce, he and his mother moved to a different town. He didn't know any of the kids there, and he had a hard time making friends. One day, when Roger was around 12 years old, a group of boys cornered him in the bathroom, calling him a faggot and shoving him around till he was knocked to the ground and kicked mercilessly. All he could do was roll up into a ball and wait for the blows to stop. When they grew tired of pummeling him and left the room, Roger got up and looked into the mirror. His lip was bleeding, his cheek had a small cut on it, and a black eye was already beginning to show. He splashed cold water onto his face and smiled. He didn't crumble into pieces like the pebbles from his youth. He was hard, unbreakable, and he knew he was about to become that heavy stone that would shatter the smaller rocks to pieces. By the time he was 18, he was leader of the Riffs, the most brutal gang in town. He controlled over half the city, and had long ago paid the cops to look the other way when any of his crew was involved. He started the gang when he was 16. He took what he wanted, and anyone who tried to stop him was usually missing a few body parts the next day. He became infamous for smashing people's hands and fingers with a sledgehammer that resembled a boulder. He called it Dad, and slept with it next to his bedside every night. He never had a permanent girlfriend. Most didn't last more than 2 weeks with Roger before their face was unrecognizable from the beatings he gave them. On the night he died, he lay awake in his bed, thinking of how he was going to hide 17 bodies in the same place. Easy, he thought. Cut them up in a wood chipper, and they would not resemble people anymore. They would be more like pebbles that have been ground to dust. When the rival gang members burst in, he tried to reach for Dad, but had his hand shot off before he even grasped the handle. They tied him to a chair and pulled out his teeth with pliers. They each took turns pulling out his fingernails. Before his eyes were gouged out, they let him witness his penis being hacked off and thrown to the floor, only to be crushed under the weight of a boot. They were dismantling him piece by piece. All that was left now was to wait for the final crushing blow. The boulder came crashing down and he woke up. Not again, thought Roger. Please, not again. The doctor came over to the table that the 5-year-old was strapped to and began to remove the electrodes from different points on Roger's head. How are we feeling now, Roger? You're halfway through the treatment program after this session. The doctor took his pulse and checked his heart rate. This anti-bullying therapy is really much more humane than how we did things in the past. Just 10 more treatments and you will be cured, my lad. How does that make you feel? Roger tried to speak, but his tongue was cut out the moment he had entered the treatment center. He tried to tell the doctor he was all better now, that he didn't mean to crush his friend's hand with the rock. It was an accident, and they were just playing a game. But only a low gurgling escaped his throat.
Walter Gascoigne, thank you very much. And we have Lisa Adamowicz Kless from the Kenosha Writers Guild. Lisa, what does somebody need to do to become a member of the guild or to participate in this show?
Well, we're a free group, so basically all you have to do is come down and join us at one of our meetings. Right now we're meeting every third Thursday of the month for our main meetings, where you can come and bring some work with you and share it with the group, get some feedback and critique on that. And then the second Thursdays of each month we have meetings where we have workshops, guest speakers, panel discussions, that sort of thing, and both of those are free and open to the public.
Excellent. And is that, where are the meetings held?
Right now we're at Carthage College, and we're in the Hedberg Library in the lower level. So you can check out our website at www.kenosha-writersguild.com to get some more information, and we also have a Facebook page, and we also have a Speaking of Our Words Facebook page too, that you can get more information about the show and about the group.
Great. Thank you very much, Lisa. And thanks again to everybody who participated in the show. So special thanks to author Michael Perry and to local writers Dave Gourdoux, Irene Bilak, Richard Bell, Walter Gascoigne, Lisa Adamowicz Kless, our engineer Troy McDonald, and WGTD. This is Jim Janus. You've been listening to Speaking of Our Words, and the world needs your stories. We'll see you again.